This isn't my first rodeo. I'm aware that every fan base has its good and bad, but most of the interactions I've had with fans of this manga haven't been pleasant. The manga is Usogui, sitting at 539 chapters and was serialized from 2006 to 2017, written by Toshio Sako. This has been one of the most requested series for me to check out, and the more that I interacted with the fans of this series, the higher my expectations were. Also, the more I was convinced 95% of this fandom was from India. Still, I wanted to give this series a fair chance, since the last manga I read that was this hyped up was Ashita no Joe. And looking back, I honestly went into that series actively looking for things to dislike, and I didn't want to make that same mistake again. Was this series really one of the, if not the best manga to exist? Well, I'd have to read it all for myself and find out. Unfortunately, it did not start off well. The premise is our main character, Madarame Baku, also known as Usogui, which translates into the Lie Eater, is an absolute monster in gambling and participates in these life-threatening gambles. But the overarching plot point is with the organization in charge of making sure these gambles are followed through with and played by the rules, for the most part known as the Kakuro. I'll paint a brief picture since this is going to be the format for the majority of the manga. Say you and I want to gamble for $10 million. No matter what game we decide to play for said money, the Kakuro will send over one of their 101 referees to survey the gamble. These aren't any normal referees, these are top-tier Hitman level referees, because nothing about this series is ordinary. Madarame's goal is to take over the organization by surpassing the current leader, and when we meet him at the beginning of the manga through Kaji, the most unlucky and really lucky individual at the same time, Baku had attempted to do so already and failed, so it's back to square one. And just in case for any confusion, I swapped between Madarame and Baku just because I can't decide which one to go with, but for this video I'll go with Baku from now on. Now, it all sounds wonderful, but what I found to be the issue for me when reading the early parts of Usogui was that because of how high Baku's character is built up to be, and how quickly he shows it's not an exaggeration, I personally wasn't as invested as I would have wanted to be, since I never really felt like he was in danger until way later in the series, and the main intrigue is seeing the creativity on display as to how he beats his opponents. But I think this is the challenge when starting off a story with a character that has already grown for the most part. It's a big mystery you peel back the layers behind why the character is the way they are over time, which in the end results in some of the most satisfying character development, but depending on how much time you take to do so, can be a real test of patience. One of my favorite things ever, the house in Fata Morgana, takes its sweet time, believe me. And I found myself feeling the way Baku handled each person he beats early on to be cool. That's really about it. I know later on in the series we would get to see more of his character and his ties to the Kakuro on a personal level, and how his bonds with his allies would grow, but as I read more and more in the early half, I felt my patience dissolving quickly. I'm interested in seeing how Kaiji grows as a character along with Marco, an absolute badass that's introduced in one of the very first arcs in the manga, but I didn't feel like I cared much for Baku himself as a character, which was the main thing I was looking forward to until 200 chapters in. And I'm aware that the series is building towards something throughout its first half, but it's a very dense read with a lot of exposition, and I mean a lot. And the dialogue can be, in all honesty, a bit repetitive and corny. At first, the "you are a liar" thing which Baku does is cool, and by the end of the series it's the best thing ever, but around the 8th, 9th time, maybe not so much. However, I think a lot of the issues with the dialogue is just the pacing of it all, and at times it could be because there isn't an official English translation, so I'll give it a pass. Essentially, the first 200 chapters of Usogui for me were kind of hit or miss, depending on what characters and conflicts the series was focusing on. It introduces a lot of characters throughout the first half, which in the moment I didn't really care about, and contributed as to why some stretches of the series was a bit of a slog to get through. And I know this sounds like a lot of negatives, but look, I don't think the first half of Usogui is bad. I think the action is cool, although you could argue it breaks up the pacing of the gambles taking place in a negative way. Later on that smoothens out, but the climaxes of the gambles themselves are some of the most thrilling things you could read. I think there were just too many moments where I was reading to get it over with and move on to the next thing, instead of feeling immersed in the moment and invested in the outcome of the characters as consistently as I would later on. It's a whole lot of stage setting, which I think was my big thing with Gintama a few years ago, and the story slowly comes together. And so one's enjoyment of the first half, I think, heavily depends on if you like the fights and the concept behind the gambles themselves. I read all the way through Labyrinth back in February of 2023, and I thought it would be more worth my time to check out and read other stuff as well as life was happening, and so I dropped it. Fast forward to the end of 2023, where I let my YouTube buddies recommend me a manga, and I had to read it no matter what, and one of them recommended Usogui. Well, now I had no choice but to continue and finish what I started. The reason I didn't do a video on why I dropped Usogui was because I knew it would be an unfair representation since I had only read the build-up without the big payoffs. And the main thing I always hear about Usogui was how the final arcs are some of the best in all of manga, and this time I would see if the fandom was right. After the Labyrinth arc, which was for the most part enjoyable, the arc right after wasn't my favorite, but I was still optimistic, especially since it felt that after that arc, the chapters went by faster and faster and the series would really never look back. By this point in the story, Baku's master plan starts to come into fruition, where he will be given the opportunity, if all things go right, to challenge once again and surpass the leader. The artwork around this point onward is some of the absolute best in all of manga, and the fights start to flow a lot better in terms of when to focus on them and when to go back to the strategic elements. The KY declaration is what I would consider the last of the preparation phase of the story. By this point, we're familiar enough with most of the important elements, and Baku is ever so close to accomplishing his goal, which he set in motion from way early on, as we would figure out. But after this, Tower of Karma is where Usogui goes from a good gambling manga with some impressive artwork into a non-stop thriller with some of the best art in all of manga, and some of my favorite character moments that I've gotten to read in the last 2 years. I also started to research more into Usogui and the manga sales. Now, manga sales aren't indicative of the quality of a series, of course. I bring this up, however, to show why I think the fans are constantly bringing up how underrated it is, at least in the sense of popularity, because damn near every person that I know that talks about Usogui has it in high regards. But here are some of the top-selling seinen manga that I think Usogui deserves to be mentioned with. Now, the length of a series can be a factor in all of this, but the only series that has more volumes than Usogui on this list is Kingdom. So how many sales is Usogui standing at? Look, this isn't a number to laugh at all. 10 million sales is more than impressive, but I can see why an underrated masterpiece is often used to describe Usogui. Apparently there was also a live-action version that came out in 2022, but I doubt that's worth checking out. What was worth checking out was Tower of Karma and the arc afterwards. Intense from start to finish, and the insanity that takes place makes me question what the author was taking while writing it. Turns out a Colombian necktie was a real thing. Tower of Karma was a delicate affair, with each character having to push their limits and work as a team to come out on top, and Battleship had my ass clenched in my seat the whole way through. I no longer feel like I need to read a certain amount to put it down. Now I'm starting to feel like I can't put it down. In what way can this manga take it all to the next level, with more outlandish gambles for the highest stakes, and in what ways can I see the bond of these characters tested as Baku gets closer to realizing his ambitions? The more we learn about the past, the more we can see the absolute genius of Madarame Baku and all the sly ways he put his plan into motion far before they ever happen. And so the more you read this manga, the better the first half looks in retrospect. Baku's patience as a character is just as insane as his needs for the ultimate thrill of the gamble. But at this point, I'm pretty sure I've seen it all. In no way can this series do something that I wouldn't expect. Well, how about a game that takes place on an entire island, where you and your team have to find a way to gain a currency and climb your way up the social ladder? The concept behind all of this had me hooked, but I think this arc could have the case for some of the best character moments in the entire series for the overall cast, where some of my personal favorites shine. Baku himself, of course, Kaji, who gets a really nice moment, Soichi, my personal favorite in the entire series, but more on him in a second, and Kiara, who is an absolute legend. Probably had my favorite fight in the entire series, and his conclusion, oh man. If you hear high praises of Usogui's cast, I think this is the arc where that really shows. I'll actually get some of my thoughts on Soichi out of the way now, but this segment will have some spoilers. Soichi is the leader of the Kakuro, and as we learn in this arc, had once a friendship of sorts with Baku. But at that time, he went under a different alias called Hal. Oh, and I totally relate to this character. Soichi is literally me, not because I'm some genius, but because I'm a perfectionist. I go by many names, and I have a horrible memory. I also really love the story within the story, the Prince B, which serves as a mirror to the dynamic between Baku and Soichi. Another example of this sort of thing would be in Monster, where you have the monster that had no name and how that correlates to Johan's character. And I think I just really like when stories do that sort of thing in the right way. But at this point in the story, we're giving a lot more context into Baku's past and his character and his willingness to now believe in others, unlike what he did in the past. Many different characters get their shine here, and Protoporus as a whole is one of the best arcs in all of manga. The referees also get a lot of shine here, as they would later on, and become memorable, and I think around here the moments of dialogue start to really hit a lot more than in the early half, but I think that's because the context we have now for the characters has helped distinguish their personalities even more, and since at this point in the story we're getting who would pretty much be the main players for the entirety of the narrative, I think the personalities are a little more fleshed out and thought out, and so it allows for more nuance within the dialogue. This is an arc that has a lot of things simultaneously happening from start to finish, but it doesn't really feel like a cluster or a mess, and I'm invested in all of it. But the crazy thing is that the best is still yet to come. Okay, so I asked a friend of mine that's a big Usogui fan, and he said Air Poker is considered its own arc. And then I asked another friend, and he said it's still Protoporos, which makes sense since it's like the finale of Protoporos. But regardless, since this is my favorite stretch, and I would actually argue the best stretch in the entire manga, Lalo, who has served as the big opposition throughout Protoporos and Baku, finally face off in a game where they are underwater and gamble for air canisters until one of them runs out and is, well, left to drown. A literal death game where the two of them are pushed to the absolute limit. Reading this part of the manga was cocaine in book form. If the mental strategy of gambling is what you're looking for, it's throughout the entirety of the series, but here, and what happens after, might be my favorite example of mind games in all of manga. It feels like the dialogue moves faster than you can keep up with as these two play the ultimate mind games with one another, and when the twist behind how the game really works is revealed, I was double mind blown. Soichi being involved in the game, and once again Baku was tested in the same thing that brought about his downfall in the past. The air poker section is like subconsciously hearing the sound effect of Sonic drowning while you anxiously hope for an escape. Not sure if I could put urgency and panic any better than that, but here we get to see three characters really define themselves in comparison to each other. Baku in his way of treating others and the lessons he learned versus Lalo and his obsession with the diamond, as I think that serves for like a symbolic thing of looking for the absolute best, perfection, and how that actually serves as a parallel comparison to Soichi's growth as a character and understanding the importance of self-acceptance, true mastery of oneself instead of the facade of perfection that Lalo has. Since perfection is a huge theme for Soichi, and the concept behind his split personalities and having a case of Joe Biden was fascinating, but the execution made him one of my all-time favorite characters. I think the way Toshio Sako handled this here allowed for Lalo as an antagonist to have a fitting ending and leave his mark on the story, as he was doing throughout Protoporos, while elevating Baku and Soichi for their inevitable matchup. If I'm not mistaken, it was also around this time where the author would go on a brief hiatus to have a boxing match, which he won, by the way. So yeah, if this man is pumping out some of the best art in the medium while training for a boxing match, that's some inspirational shit, and you have no excuse not to be hitting the gym. But to have some of the best action and character moments in Protoporos, where I thought the manga couldn't get much better, only for the climax of air poker to prove me wrong, was a high that very few manga have been able to compete with. By now, I'm deeply invested not just in Baku as a character and all of those on his side, along with some of the referees, but also the main antagonist Soichi, which is everything I wanted when I got into this manga. With all the momentum in the world, I'm motivated to see the grand conclusion of this epic story, and also get a Rubik's Cube to finally solve it. The final arc of the manga, Surpassing the Leader, is less about the complexity of the game taking place in comparison to air poker, but instead the mind game between two individuals far beyond normal human ability. Two masterminds facing off once again. So much has had to happen for this moment, and now that it's here, it does not disappoint. There is a moment of absurdity with Soichi where I kinda laughed, but was willing to suspend my disbelief and the explanation given, because it at least contributes to the tension of the moment, as well as play into the level that Soichi reached through a difficult path of growth. Just like with air poker, I think this arc is a strong showing of the character's self-realization and thought process of their opponent through gambling, and the artwork portrays it beautifully. If I can make a comparison, it reminds me to how Shinichi Sakamoto goes about showing that type of thing in Climber and Innocent. There isn't much I can say that will put into terms how good the finale to this manga is. From seeing the referees compete to see who will officiate the match, to the constant tightness you feel after turning every single page. I've brought up recently in some videos one of the many things I've learned from Solstein's book on writing, and that is the main difference between fiction and nonfiction, and that is nonfiction is meant to relay information, while fictional stories are meant to make you feel. While reading the first half of the manga, I felt like there were too many moments, not all, where I was simply taking in the information of what was going on, since the story wasn't at a point, I think, with the characters to make me feel every moment of suspense, victory, defeat. But from Tower of Karma on, I think very few manga have been able to make me feel the level of anxiousness while reading. The payoff of the final arcs make the long build-up worth it, and I would argue the second half wouldn't be as satisfying if the author didn't carefully craft everything to fall into place. If you were looking for a series that has a more enjoyable experience from start to end, then I would suggest Kaiji, since I think that's a wonderful read, but the best of Usogui, and really the series as a whole, deserves to be brought up with some of the best manga of all time. Now, as for who comes out on top at the very end, those who know, know, and those who don't know, I'm surprised you're still here, but you're gonna have to read to find out for yourself. I still think the whole clears fiction, negs fiction lingo is some of the most middle school loser-ass shit, but this manga is a really unique and special experience. A great main character, one of the best main antagonists, a really solid cast, creative mind games, awesome fights, and once again, just some mind-blowing artwork. Usogui is a series that will take a good amount of time to get through, but it's more than worth the gamble. The fans say it's one of the best manga out there, and I'd have to say they're right. If you enjoyed this video, subscribing and leaving a like would be greatly appreciated, as well as I do have a Patreon for anyone interested. As always, this has been The Masked Man. Hope everyone has a blessed rest of the day, and peace.